Edward IV's rise to power was one of the most dramatic in English history. Born into the powerful Yorkist family during the turbulent Wars of the Roses, Edward was tall, charismatic, and militarily gifted. In 1461, at just 19 years old, he defeated the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. With this victory, he seized the English crown and became the first Yorkist king, remembered as the White King because of the white rose emblem of his house. Edward was unlike many medieval kings. Standing at over 6 feet tall, he was an imposing figure, admired for his striking looks, charm, and energy. His physical presence and battlefield brilliance helped him win the loyalty of soldiers and nobles alike. But it was not only his military skill that made him a king, it was his boldness and ambition. Edward IV had the vision of building a strong Yorkist dynasty that could finally end the chaos of civil war. Yet his reign would be forever defined by a love story that shocked England. In 1464, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of the Lancastrian side and the woman of relatively modest noble birth. Their union stunned the court. Elizabeth was not a foreign princess or a great heiress chosen for political advantage. She was a woman of beauty, intelligence, and ambition who captured Edward's heart. Their marriage was a scandal because it bypassed the careful alliances that medieval kings usually forged through marriage. Elizabeth's rise to queenship marked a turning point in English history. She was the first English-born commoner to become queen consort, and her sudden elevation disrupted the balance of power at court. Many nobles, especially Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, felt betrayed. Warwick had been negotiating for Edward to marry a French princess, and Edward's defiance humiliated him. This betrayal set the stage for one of the greatest political rivalries of the age. Despite the controversy, Elizabeth proved to be a strong and shrewd queen. She worked tirelessly to secure power for her large Woodville family, marrying her siblings into influential positions and raising their status. This favoritism fueled resentment among the old nobility, who viewed the Woodvilles as opportunistic upstarts. Yet, Elizabeth was determined to defend her family's place in the kingdom, even against powerful enemies. Their marriage also reflected Edward's independence as a ruler. Unlike many kings before him, he refused to be controlled by his advisors or manipulated into political matches. Edward chose love over politics, a decision that humanizes him in history, but also contributed to instability. His relationship with Elizabeth showed both the strength of his character and the risks of defying tradition in a society governed by alliances and bloodlines. Their story was set against the backdrop of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster for control of the throne. Edward's victories brought temporary peace, but the opposition never disappeared. The Lancastrians continued to plot, and Warwick, once Edward's greatest ally, turned against him. At the heart of these shifting alliances was the resentment toward Elizabeth and her family, whose presence at court was seen as an intrusion. Edward and Elizabeth's marriage also carried symbolic power. Together, they represented a new kind of monarchy, one rooted not only in dynastic ambition, but also in personal choice and emotional connection. This defied medieval expectations and created a legacy that fascinated later generations. Their love story became one of the defining romances of English royal history, though it was shadowed by the political turmoil it caused. As queen, Elizabeth endured both triumph and tragedy. She gave birth to many children, including the ill-fated princes in the Tower, whose mysterious disappearance remains one of history's greatest enigmas. She was both a devoted mother and a shrewd political operator, navigating the treacherous world of court politics with determination. In her, we see not just a queen consort, but a survivor who shaped the destiny of her family. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville remain figures of fascination because their story blends romance, politics, and tragedy. They were the White King and Queen, symbols of love and ambition during one of the most violent chapters in English history. Their legacy lives on not just in the dynastic struggles of the 15th century, but also in the enduring power of their remarkable union. Edward's decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville not only changed his personal life, it changed the very course of English politics. The Woodvilles, once a relatively modest family from Northamptonshire, suddenly found themselves elevated into the highest ranks of society. Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, had already been a powerful figure, but now her influence grew immensely. Her brothers and sisters were married into noble families, binding the Woodvilles into the web of English aristocracy. This sudden rise, however, provoked jealousy and outrage among established magnates who felt threatened by the newcomers. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, was the most dangerous of these enemies. Known as the Kingmaker for his role in placing Edward on the throne, Warwick had expected to control the king and dictate policy. Edward's independence and his marriage to Elizabeth destroyed this illusion. Warwick was furious that years of careful planning for a French alliance had been undone by Edward's secret wedding. For Warwick, this was not just a personal insult, but a betrayal of England's foreign policy and the fragile Yorkist cause. The rivalry between Warwick and the Woodvilles became one of the defining conflicts of Edward's reign. Warwick tried to undermine Elizabeth by spreading rumors and working with disaffected nobles. At one point, Warwick even rebelled against Edward, capturing him briefly and attempting to rule through him. The king, however, proved far more resilient than Warwick expected. Edward escaped, regrouped, and reasserted his authority. Warwick's rebellion showed just how dangerous internal rivalries could be during the Wars of the Roses. Elizabeth, meanwhile, showed herself to be far from a passive queen. She actively worked to strengthen her family's position, arranging marriages and cultivating alliances. Many viewed her as ambitious and calculating, but these qualities were necessary for survival in the brutal world of 15th century politics. For Elizabeth, every alliance secured, every child married advantageously, was a way of protecting not just her own status, but also the future of the Yorkist dynasty. The couple's personal life was equally significant. Edward and Elizabeth had 10 children, including Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, the two young princes whose fate in the Tower of London would become one of history's darkest mysteries. The Queen's role as a mother cannot be overstated. She was devoted to her children and fiercely protective of their inheritance. Her maternal instincts often intersected with her political ambitions, driving her to fight for the rights of her offspring in a dangerous and unstable kingdom. Edward IV also faced challenges from abroad. The Lancastrians, though weakened, were not entirely defeated. Margaret of Anjou, wife of the deposed Henry VI, continued to rally support for her son's claim to the throne. With French backing, the Lancastrians remained a threat. For Edward, balancing foreign alliances and domestic stability was a constant struggle. His marriage to Elizabeth had personal meaning, but politically it isolated him from potential allies in France and Burgundy. Despite these obstacles, Edward was a shrewd and effective ruler. He reformed England's finances, promoted trade, and strengthened royal authority. His charm and ability to inspire loyalty made him a popular figure, especially among the common people. Yet his reliance on the Woodvilles remained a source of weakness, fueling opposition among nobles who resented their growing influence. In many ways, Edward's reign was a balancing act between love and politics, old nobility and new, stability and rebellion. Elizabeth herself endured constant scrutiny. As a woman of non-royal birth who rose to queenship, she became a symbol of both opportunity and resentment. To her supporters, she embodied the idea that personal merit could triumph over aristocratic privilege. To her enemies, she represented dangerous ambition
and the corruption of the monarchy by upstarts. This duality would define her reputation for centuries, making her one of the most controversial queens in English history. The marriage of Edward and Elizabeth was also a union of opposites. Edward was bold, extroverted, and charismatic, while Elizabeth was often described as composed, dignified, and calculating. Together, they balanced each other, creating a partnership that, despite its challenges, endured for over 22 years. Their story was not of fleeting passion, but of sustained loyalty and shared ambition, even in the face of relentless opposition. As the 1460s drew to a close, the storm clouds of rebellion continued to gather. Warwick, alienated and bitter, began plotting with Edward's own brother, George the Duke of Clarence. Their alliance against the king and queen would plunge England back into civil war, setting the stage for betrayal, battles, and bloodshed that would once again test Edward's strength and Elizabeth's resilience. The White King and Queen stood united, but their enemies were gathering with deadly intent.
The rebellion of Warwick and Clarence struck at the very heart of Edward IV's rule. Warwick, once Edward's most trusted ally, now sought to topple him from the throne, aligning himself with Edward's ambitious brother George, who resented the influence of the Woodvilles and dreamed of wearing the crown himself. This alliance was devastating for Edward, not just because of the military threat it posed, but because it revealed the deep fractures within his own family. In 1469, Warwick and Clarence raised an army and confronted Edward at the Battle of Edgecote Moor. The king's forces were defeated, and Edward himself was captured. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Warwick had regained control of England. Yet Edward's popularity and the loyalty of key supporters ensured that Warwick could not hold him for long. The king was released, and Warwick was forced into exile. But the seeds of betrayal had been sown, and the fragile stability of the Yorkist reign was once again under threat. Elizabeth Woodville, during this period, found herself in one of the most precarious positions of her life. With her husband imprisoned, she feared for the safety of her children and her family. Yet she displayed remarkable resilience. Drawing upon the support of her mother Jacquetta and her network of Woodville kin, she maintained the Queen's household and ensured that the Yorkist cause still had a figure of authority at its head. Her determination during these dark days underscored her strength as both queen and mother. The return of Warwick in alliance with the Lancastrians marked one of the most dramatic reversals in English history. Warwick, the kingmaker who had once destroyed the Lancastrians, now restored them by bringing Henry VI back to the throne. For Edward and Elizabeth, this was a moment of catastrophe. The Yorkist king and queen were forced to flee into exile, seeking refuge in Burgundy. Elizabeth, heavily pregnant at the time, faced a dangerous journey across hostile territory, a queen without a kingdom, carrying the future of the dynasty within her. In sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth gave birth to her son, the future Edward V. The image of the queen, cloaked in humility, giving birth in the shadow of war, became symbolic of the Yorkist struggle. For her supporters, Elizabeth was not just a queen, but a figure of endurance, embodying the hardships of her family and her cause. The safe delivery of her son in such desperate circumstances offered a flicker of hope that the Yorkist line would endure. Meanwhile, Edward IV rallied his forces abroad. With the support of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, he prepared a daring campaign to reclaim his throne. In 1471, Edward returned to England, landing on the coast and gathering men as he marched toward London. Elizabeth's prayers were answered when her husband regained the city without bloodshed, reuniting with her and their children. For a brief moment, the Yorkist family was whole again, but the real test still lay ahead. The climactic battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury sealed the fate of the Lancastrians. Warwick, once the most powerful man in England, fell in battle, and with him the last hopes of Lancastrian restoration were crushed. Edward IV re-entered London in triumph, and Elizabeth Woodville was restored to her throne beside him. But these victories came at a terrible cost. The blood of thousands of Englishmen spilled, the kingdom once again torn by war,
and the knowledge that Edward's own brother, George Clarence, had betrayed him. Elizabeth's role after these victories was significant. She worked tirelessly to restore stability to the court and to celebrate Yorkist triumphs. Festivals, feasts, and ceremonies were organized to reassert the legitimacy of Edward's rule and to bind the nobility to the crown. But she was always aware that peace was fragile, and her vigilance as queen never wavered. She knew that the dynasty she and Edward had built remained vulnerable to the tides of ambition and treachery. Even in triumph, Elizabeth faced personal losses. The death of her father and brother, executed by Warwick's faction, haunted her. She understood better than anyone that political power carried immense risks, and that her family's sudden rise had made them targets for envy and revenge. Her grief was private, but it added to the steel in her character, reinforcing her determination to secure the Yorkist future. By the early 1470s, Edward IV and Elizabeth appeared stronger than ever. Their children were growing, their dynasty seemed secure, and their enemies had been defeated. But the Wars of the Roses were never truly over. The seeds of future tragedy were already planted, hidden in the jealousies of the nobility, the ambitions of Edward's brothers, and the fragile nature of medieval kingship. For now, though, Edward and Elizabeth could savor their hard-won victory and the restoration of their reign as the White King and Queen of England.
After his resounding victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury, Edward IV stood at the height of his power. The Lancastrian line had been shattered. Henry VI, the once pitiful monarch, died mysteriously in the Tower, likely on Edward's orders. Queen Margaret of Anjou, once the fiercest rival of the Yorkists, was captured and sent into exile. For the first time in decades, it seemed England could enjoy a semblance of peace. Edward and Elizabeth were firmly restored, and the White King and Queen now reigned over a kingdom momentarily free from rebellion. The couple turned their attention to consolidating power. Edward sought to reward his supporters and to strengthen royal finances, while Elizabeth devoted herself to securing advantageous marriages for her growing brood of children. Every alliance mattered, for each child represented a potential link to other noble houses and European courts. The Woodville family once again flourished in prominence, taking up influential roles in both court and kingdom. Elizabeth's efforts to establish her children were particularly ambitious. Her daughters, raised in a court steeped in refinement, were seen as valuable matches for noblemen at home and abroad. Most significantly, her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, was groomed for a role that would one day prove pivotal in uniting England. Yet at the time, these plans also fueled resentment. The nobility viewed the queen as overreaching, accusing her of manipulating royal policy for Woodville gain. The crown's renewed strength, however, could not silence Edward's restless brother George, Duke of Clarence. Ever ambitious and dissatisfied with his share of power, Clarence spread whispers of treachery, accusing Elizabeth of sorcery and plotting against him. This was a dangerous accusation in a superstitious age, but Edward would no longer tolerate his brother's scheming. In 1478, Clarence was arrested for treason and, in a grim spectacle, executed by drowning in a butt of wine. For Elizabeth, this was a bittersweet moment. One rival had been removed, but it was also a chilling reminder of how blood ties offered no protection in the brutal struggle for power. Edward IV's reign entered a period of relative stability in the 1480s. Trade with Burgundy flourished, the court grew wealthy, and the splendor of the Yorkist dynasty was on display. Elizabeth presided over a glittering court filled with pageantry, music, and elaborate displays of power. Her queenship was marked by magnificence, but beneath the grandeur, she never forgot the dangers that had once forced her into sanctuary. She knew the wheel of fortune could turn at any moment. Elizabeth's greatest achievement during these years was her influence in shaping her children into symbols of Yorkist legitimacy. Her sons, Edward and Richard, were raised as heirs to continue the dynasty, while her daughters represented dynastic strength. Yet the fragility of medieval kingship was never far away. The health of Edward IV, once robust and energetic, began to decline. His indulgence in rich foods and his increasingly sedentary lifestyle took their toll, casting a shadow over the security of the family's future. In 1483, tragedy struck. Edward IV, the White King, died suddenly at the age of just 40. His passing threw the realm into turmoil. Elizabeth, now Queen Dowager, faced the daunting task of protecting her young son, Edward V, who was only 12 years old. The kingdom held its breath as the boy prepared to be crowned, but already whispers of ambition and betrayal swirled around the court. The most dangerous figure was none other than Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's loyal brother, or so it had seemed. Richard had long presented himself as a faithful servant of the crown, but with Edward's death, his ambitions came into the open. He positioned himself as the protector of his nephew Edward V, promising to safeguard the boy king. Elizabeth, wary from her past, immediately recognized the peril of entrusting her son to Richard's care. The queen once again sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, taking her younger children with her, including her second son, Richard of Shrewsbury. It was a haunting echo of her earlier refuge during the Lancastrian Restoration. This time, however, the threat was even closer to home. Elizabeth was a mother, fighting desperately to preserve the lives of her sons against the tide of treachery. Richard of Gloucester moved swiftly. He intercepted the young Edward V on his way to London, seizing control of him. Soon afterward, he persuaded Elizabeth to release her younger son Richard into his custody. Both boys were lodged in the Tower of London, supposedly in preparation for the coronation. But Elizabeth, with a mother's intuition, knew what this truly meant. Her sons were now prisoners, and the future of the Yorkist dynasty hung by the thinnest of threads.
The disappearance of Elizabeth's sons, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, remains one of the darkest mysteries in English history. Known to posterity as the Princes in the Tower, the boys were last seen within the walls of the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. Soon after, their uncle Richard declared them illegitimate, claiming Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had never been lawful. With this justification, he seized the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. For Elizabeth, the loss was devastating. A mother robbed not only of her sons, but of their rightful place on the throne. She was forced into silence as rumors spread that the princes had been murdered, possibly on Richard's orders. Though no one could prove their fate, the absence of the boys spoke louder than any words. Elizabeth, already hardened by years of political struggle, now faced her most bitter trial, mourning children who had been the hope of her dynasty. Richard III's reign cast Elizabeth into political obscurity, but she did not fade quietly. Instead, she began to weave a new plan for survival. With her daughters still under her protection, Elizabeth knew they remained valuable pieces on England's political chessboard. Chief among them was her eldest, Elizabeth of York, a young woman whose royal blood made her a figure of immense importance. In secret, Elizabeth Woodville began to ally herself with Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant exiled in Brittany. Through correspondence and secret negotiations, she agreed that if Henry successfully invaded and overthrew Richard, he would marry her daughter, Elizabeth of York. This daring move was nothing less than a gamble with the future of the kingdom, but it was a gamble that ultimately paid off. Henry Tudor's invasion culminated in the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where Richard III was defeated and killed. With his victory, Henry became King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. True to his word, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster. This marriage became the symbolic end of the Wars of the Roses, birthing a new dynasty that would shape England for generations. Elizabeth Woodville, though no longer queen, had secured her family's legacy. Through her daughter's marriage, she became the grandmother of Henry VIII and great-grandmother of Elizabeth I. The Tudors,
who presided over some of England's most iconic moments in history, owed their throne in no small part to Elizabeth's resilience, cunning, and determination to protect her bloodline. Yet Elizabeth's later years were tinged with tragedy and suspicion. Henry VII, wary of her influence and her powerful Woodville relatives, gradually distanced himself from court. She was sent into retirement at Bermondsey Abbey, where she lived quietly until her death in 1492. Once the glittering queen at the center of England's storm, she ended her life in relative obscurity, far removed from the power she had once wielded. Edward IV, remembered as the White King, had been a ruler of contrasts, a warrior who won his throne through battle, yet also a man of charm, prone to indulgence and passion. Elizabeth, his queen, mirrored these contrasts, a woman dismissed as an ambitious commoner, yet ultimately one of the most influential figures of her age. Together, they embodied the turbulence of the 15th century, their reign a bridge between the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and the dawn of Tudor stability. Their story is not simply one of romance or betrayal, but of survival. Against overwhelming odds, Elizabeth Woodville carved out a place in history, ensuring that her bloodline endured even as others fell to the axe or the battlefield. Her children's fate may have haunted her, but her daughter's triumph guaranteed that Elizabeth's name would never be forgotten. The legacy of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville lives on in the Tudor rose, the emblem of unity that fused the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster. Their reign, marked both by triumph and tragedy, left an indelible mark on English history. The White King and Queen's story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, ambition, resilience, and cunning could alter the fate of nations.